book about the Jews who braved the frontier, the American Coliseum, or pioneers, as you may call them. Ken Libo is here with us today, who collaborated with Irving Howe on We Live There Too, which is a documented history of the pioneer Jews and the Westward movement of the Americans from 1630 to 1930. And I may add that Ken Libo and Irving Howe collaborated on such works as The World of Our Fathers and How We Lived. And it's really a pleasure to have you with us today, Kenneth. First, I want to know about the Jewish cowboys. When we think of the cowboy movies, we see the God-fearing Americans and singing, bringing in the sheaves in their churches. Is there such a thing as Jewish cowboys?
Definitely. They were cowboys, and cowboys with a difference, but a difference that maybe people like Mel Brooks are not aware of. And that is that they probably, as Mel Brooks and Woody Allen would be aware of, had difficulty riding a horse, just as any greenhorn would have. But what I really admire about the Jewish cowboys, particularly the ones who wrote lengthy articles for the Jewish Daily Forward in the 20s and 30s about their experiences, is that many of them had a moral sense about being a Jewish cowboy. And there's an excerpt in the book We Live There Too by Isaac Raboy, a Yiddish writer for the Jewish Daily Forward, who went out to the North Dakota Plains where he was a cowboy, and he wrote very movingly about the American Indian. And he identified with the American Indian, and he felt that they were getting a raw deal. And indeed, the reader of the Jewish Daily Forward probably knows more about the American Indian just by having read the accounts of Isaac Raboy than people who have been reading about Indians in recent times.
You said these Jewish cowboys were imbued with a moral sense. Did that have anything to do with them being Jewish?
I think what they did was they could relate and identify with the Indian, that they realized that they came themselves from a background of persecution, and they resented the fact that the Indians were being persecuted. And I admire cowboys like Isaac Raboy because they did take a moral stand. It was one that perhaps only a small Yiddish readership knew about, but nevertheless, in moral terms, it was important. There were all kinds of cowboys, though, in the West. There were Yiddish-speaking cowboys. There were also German-speaking cowboys who came in the 1850s and 60s. There was one guy, Sigmund Schlesinger, who came to America before the Civil War, and he was restless, he was young, he didn't want to be a clerk on the Lower East Side, so he went out to Kansas, and he proved himself finally. At first, people made fun of him because he didn't ride a horse the way other people did, but he finally learned, and in an excerpt in We Live There Too from his journals, he describes how he takes part in Indian fights and how finally he has the mixed blessing, I would say, of scalping 3 Indians. So you have Jews who are both the foes of the Indian and Jews who are the friends of the Indian. And you find that this is so throughout the American experience, that Jews occupy a very wide range of roles.
And sometimes there's something in me that wants to call this chaps and chaplains.
Chaps and chaplains, it's true, yeah. There were many frontier rabbis also who went out west, and these were circuit preachers who would travel from town to town, and they were also people who had many talents. It wasn't enough if you were on the if you were on the American Jewish frontier to simply be a rabbi. You had to know how to be a moel, how to be a melamed, how to be a shamus.
Okay, I'm glad you're mentioning these. I want to. How was their settlement different than the Eastern European Jews who just stayed on the Lower East Side? They came through Ellis Island, were processed, and they just stayed there and developed almost their own little shtetls. How was their settlement different?
Well,
the acceptance, assimilation, the synagogue.
I would say that the Jews who stayed, and this is an irony, the Jews who remained east were not able to reestablish the life of the East European shtetl because the life in the ghetto was so radically different. And what you discover is that the Jew who did go west was really closer to the East European shtetl experience than the Jew who remained east in America, because he had the same, a similar economic relationship with the Gentile in the West as he had in Eastern Europe. Take Chicago, for example. Here you have a large Polish and Lithuanian Gentile population. And the Jews who came here in the middle and late 19th century were able to reestablish ties with these people, with these Christians from Eastern Europe that they had in Eastern Europe. Now, when the Jew remained in the Lower East Side, he lived predominantly among Jews, and his business was conducted among Jews, which was something that wasn't the case in Eastern Europe. And you find that when you get to communities as far west as Fargo, North Dakota, and as Portland, Oregon, you have already a recreation of an American shtetl, where you have a rabbi, you have a Jewish community of 1,000 people, and you have all of the necessities.
Well, were they forced into that shtetl environment? Were they accepted by their Gentile brethren?
They were, I think the further west that you go, the more tolerant you find that the Christians or the Gentiles are of Jews, for a number of reasons. On the frontier, it wasn't possible for people to make distinctions between who was Christian and who was not Christian because of the survival imperative. If indeed they were going to start quibbling about whether or not you were a Christian, it would be possible that the entire community could go under. And also, the Jew played a very important role when he went out west in helping a community get on its feet. And these were new, raw frontier communities, and the Jew brought with him an urban know-how that the Gentile just didn't have. And for that reason, you find something very extraordinary happening when you get far west, and that is the tremendous importance of the Jews in the political arena.
There was a mayor in San Francisco.
Yes,
in Kansas.
not only was there a mayor in San Francisco, but there was a mayor in every major western settlement west of the Mississippi River before 1900. And I'm talking about mayors in Boise, Idaho, in Deadwood, South Dakota, in Tombstone, Arizona. I'm talking about Barry Goldwater's grandfather, Big Mike Goldwater, who was mayor of Prescott, Arizona, the territorial capital. The first mayor of Albuquerque, New Mexico, was a Jew.
What accounts for that? I mean, now San Francisco has another Jewish mayor.
Another, but of course, 70 years ago, Adolf Sutro was the mayor of San Francisco, because these Jews had a very specialized urban knowledge. They had autonomous Jewish communities in Eastern and Western Europe, and they knew how to run a city in a way that other people didn't know.
It didn't work in New York, though. When a commissioner of New York made anti-Semitic statements, Jacob Schiff wouldn't even speak out against him.
It didn't work in New York because Jews, although Jews were here from the very beginning, the Jews did not play as an important role in the East, where there wasn't, where they were not as close to the frontier, and where others could provide political know-how or urban know-how or administrative know-how that didn't require Jewish input. But when you get out to the frontier, where, say, people like Mike Goldwater settled, or where the early Jewish 49ers settled on the West Coast, you find that the fellow pioneer turns to the Jew because he tends to be the best prepared person.
Industrious,
He's industrial, resourceful, and knowledgeable, and literate. You have to realize that many people who went west didn't know how to read or write, and that these Jews who did go west could read and write in several languages.
What about the professions? When we think of the Jewish immigrant, we think of dry goods, the pushcart peddler. What happened to that part of their life?
I'd have to say that Jews were primarily in dry goods and clothing. And many people that I talk to sort of have a ho-hum attitude about it because they don't see any romance in dry goods. But
Levi Strauss did.
Levi Strauss saw lots of romance in dry goods. And in fact, I read in the Wall Street Journal today that Levi Strauss is the largest apparel company in the world, which is interesting. Of course, Levi Strauss himself had such an interesting history, and he's typical of many of these early pioneer immigrants. He came here in the 1840s. His brothers were already running a little dry goods store in New York, and they got together and they said, "Listen, Levi, this city doesn't have as many opportunities as other places. Why don't you take our dry goods, put them on your back, and simply go," and they pointed west, "go west." So Levi went west to Kentucky.
$400 later, that was expensive.
Yes, he went west, he went to Kentucky, he worked for 6 years, he saved his money, and he finally had enough to get to California, where he did very nicely.
The rest is history. It's all behind us now, we could kind of
but
say.
They started in dry goods, but then they went into other things. They often went into mining. They went into, they were very active in real estate development. Many of them became very successful farmers. One of the largest farmers in Phoenix was Jewish and had 7,200 acres. He and another farmer in New Mexico introduced dry ditch irrigation. And before that, you simply couldn't farm the land. But with their imagination, the land became very productive.
You know, I sense this feeling of being absorbed almost like a sponge into the society in which they moved into. What happened to the Jewish baggage? I mean, these people came with Yiddish. These are years of Jewish baggage and fleeing, pogroms, bazaars. What happened to that? What happened to the Yiddish?
Well, Yiddish culture, say, for the Yiddish-speaking Jew who went west, you have to realize that Jewish culture, religious culture, and secular culture is portable. You can almost literally put Jewish culture in a suitcase and take it anywhere around the world and still be Jewish. All that you need to be a good, devout, Orthodox Jew is a lot of discipline, stamina, and 9 other male Jews to form a minyan. And indeed, even in terms of culture, if you had, say, your Jewish Daily Forward coming to you every day, you at least had some Yiddish culture. If you had a little social club that you could form, where you had other Jewish people, you had Yiddish culture. In cities like Denver and St. Louis, as early as the 1880s and 90s, you had traveling Yiddish theatrical companies that would come 3 or 4 times a year so that you could see a Yiddish play.
All this seems to add up to Jewish survival. How possible was it to keep that, the golden chain of survival?
I think that it depended on the individual, and I would say that where there was a will, there was a way, and I will give you one dramatic example. In many cases, and I'm not trying to paint too rosy a picture, in many cases you have such rapid assimilation that when you blink an eye, you lose a Jewish community, and this is certainly still the case in certain areas of the country. In other cases, you have examples of where there is a will, there is a way. And one example is a Yiddish pioneer mother and wife. Her name is Anna Freudenthal Solomon. She and her husband Isidore went out west by covered wagon and buckboard to the Arizona-New Mexico border, where they founded the town of Solomonville, which they named after themselves. And they ran a grocery store, a general store, a post office, and a hotel where Anna's Yiddish cooking was known from Tucson to El Paso. But what's important, and what I'm getting to, is the fact that Anna had 5 daughters. And she had 5 daughters at a time when there probably weren't more than 50 eligible Jewish bachelors within a 700-mile radius. And somehow, through just force of will and ingenuity, Anna Solomon managed to get every one of her daughters married to Jews.
What happened to the other 45 men?
Well, the other 45 men, some of them went back to Europe where they found Jewish wives. Some of them, like Barry Goldwater's grandfather, brought their wives with them, and their wives remained on the West Coast. And they visited with their wives only over Passover and the Jewish New Year.
Yeah, I'm reminded of, there's a little excerpt from your passage. You talk about Otto Mears, who I think is like a Jewish Vanderbilt, you know, the Rio Grande Southern Railroad.
A railroad builder, a pathfinder.
300 miles of highway network.
In southwestern Colorado.
And he was from Lithuania, and he was...
From Russia, actually.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Russia.
Close.
And he would speak with Chief Ure and speak Ute Ute, the language of Ute, in a Yiddish accent,
Yes.
which reminds me of Mel Brooks and
Yes.
his Indian saying, "Lost some game."
Yes. Mel Brooks is one of my favorite comedians, but I think we really have to get beyond Mel Brooks. And we have to realize that even though there's something funny about Otto Mears speaking in a Yiddish accent to Chief Ure of the Utes, nevertheless, here was a guy who already was proficient in probably 3 or 4 languages. He knew Russian, he knew Lithuanian, he knew German, he knew English, he knew Yiddish, so he learned Ute. It wasn't that difficult for him. And these people were already multilingual, these Yiddish-speaking people. And they also could develop a rapport with Indians that others couldn't because they were sympathetic.
Except there also was some risk-taking involved in trading with, a lot of them did become Indian traders, and that's not Traitor.
Yes, a lot of them became Indian traders, and some of them became Indian traitors. Yes.
There were risks. The Levites had some problems with their trains being raided, didn't they? So as much rapport that they developed, there also were some risks in dealing with the Indians.
Even back in the 18th century, during the Pontiac uprising, there was a young Jewish Indian trader called Levi Andrew Levy, who was captured by Pontiac's braves and barely got out with his life. There were also risks as far as Jewish survival goes. There was a peddler called Louis Friedlander who went out to Washington during the frontier days and fell in love with an Indian princess called Elizabeth. And indeed, in We Live There Too, there is a picture of Elizabeth Friedlander in Indian regalia. I also met with the son of an Indian princess and a Polish-Jewish Indian trader. His name is Karl Bibo, and his mother was Princess Juana of the Acoma tribe, and Princess Juana and his father Solomon later settled in California, where Karl was brought up in a Jewish tradition.
I want to clarify, it's not the kind of princess most people will think of.
No, she was not.
Truly
she was
a
not. Yes,
princess.
she was just an Indian, an Ip, as opposed to a Jap, an Indian princess.
There's also some inference to the, I don't know if it's legend, myth, what have you, that the Indian tribes, some of them believe to be descendants of the Israeli
lost tribes. This
How valid?
This was a myth that I think is totally mythological, which was started, God knows how long ago, but it certainly existed during the time that the Jews first started coming to America. And many of the English indeed wrote books about the Indians being the 10 lost tribes of Israel. And it was part of the romantic shtick, I would say, of the 17th century, which we have to take with a grain of salt.
You don't believe it a little bit?
Well, let's put it this way. I would like to believe it, and I won't go any further. And whenever I like to believe something, I become very skeptical of myself.
We're talking about the myths and the Indians being somehow related to the 10 lost tribes. You, being a historian, probably explored this with great depth and with some know-how. Were there any unexpected surprises as you explored this topic?
Well, there were certain prejudices within me that I finally managed to dispel. And I'm afraid that I am beleaguered by a certain parochialism of people who have grown up east of the Hudson River. And people who grow up east of the Hudson River assume that Jewish life stops on the eastern bank.
It did, didn't it?
Well,
until your book came out.
Until my book came out. That's a slight exaggeration. But I remember when I was an officer in the Navy many years ago, I was stationed in Charleston and went one Friday night to a service at Temple Beth Elohim. And some very charming mothers walked up to me because they saw me as an eligible bachelor. And they said, "Would you all like to come home for Shabbos dinner?" And I said to myself, well, these people are obviously pretending that they're Jewish. How can people say y'all and be Jewish? And when I went out west to do my research, I discovered people who seemed very much a part of regional America. They were Midwesterners, they were far Westerners who had become part and parcel of this part of the country. And I decided that I simply had to do something to dispel this strange parochial perception that I had of the Jew as being basically somebody who comes out of an Eastern urban environment.
What was the most surprising fact you hit upon?
The most surprising fact in the book? Well, I would say that Jews and Indians were as close as they were, and that they traded together, that they often became friendly, that the Jew made more efforts, I think, than the average Christian to get to know the Indian, that his intellectual curiosity made him learn the language of the Indian. There's a case of the father of a Jewish governor of New Mexico who becomes a collector of Indian art in Santa Fe long before it becomes fashionable to do so.
You mentioned New Mexico. Now I want to cross the border and talk about the Indian Jews in Mexico. I believe it's called Venta Prieta. How did they get there?
Well, the Mexican Jews got there initially because the story starts with 1492 and the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. And many of the Jews, when they were expelled from Spain, went to the four corners of the earth. And some of them ended up in the New World, in Mexico and in South America, where indeed the arm of the Inquisition did not quite reach. So that you find that once these Jews are able to settle in Mexico and in South America, they can live a bit more freely than they could have in the old country. And gradually they become part and parcel of the general community.
What about today? They still living there?
There are stories today of people in Mexico who adhere to customs which seem to have Jewish elements about them, and there's no explaining it. And they don't know why they do the things that they do. So that suddenly you might come across an Indian in Mexico who's eating some matzah. And you might say to him, well, why are you eating this piece of matzah? And he'll say, well, I don't know. It's just
tradition.
It's tradition that always comes the spring, we eat matzah, or we eat whatever they call it. And this has been carried on from generation to generation.
I'm going to make a checkerboard move and take about 2 leaps backwards, something I probably should have done at the beginning of the interview. How did these Jews actually move westward? Why did they forge west? And did Jacob Schiff have anything to do with it?
Jacob did, and I'll come to Jacob in a few minutes, but I think even more important than Jacob Schiff was that you have to have a grasp of an economic situation that existed among these Jews. And that was that they created economic networks, and that these economic networks were always pushing west. And this began even as early as the 17th century, where already you have Jewish enclaves, economic enclaves in Western Europe, and these Jews in these enclaves are encouraging younger, more adventurous relatives and friends to go west, to go to the New World, to represent them in business interests. So by the late 18th century, Jews are playing a tremendously important role in all phases of new industries, cotton, indigo, rice. And in the 19th century, this tradition continues, where you have important German Jewish settlements along the lakes and along the seaboard. And these German Jews who are established are encouraging younger relatives and friends to go out and do business in the hinterland. So it is already perpetuated by the culture itself. But when you have the East European migration of hundreds and thousands of Jews coming who do not know a language other than their own Jewish language, Yiddish, and who therefore cluster among each other so that they don't feel afraid and alienated in a foreign world, you have something new happening. And it was to this situation that Jacob Schiff and other wealthy German Jews addressed themselves.
About 1906.
About in the early years of the 20th century, 1903, 1905, 1906. And Jacob Schiff and other wealthy German Jews started an organization has a very frightening name. It was called the Industrial Removal Office. And these German, it sounds like waste removal, and I'm afraid in the shadow of the Holocaust it is not a name that we can take lightly to, but we have to realize that there was no malice aforethought here. and that the German Jews simply wanted to disperse the East European immigrants. And they said, look, if you would like to go west and start life anew, then fine and well. We will give you money for train fare and you can go west. And they had another idea which was called the Galveston movement, and that was that if you want to go right to the American heartland from Russia and bypass New York, we will take you by ship to Galveston. And from Galveston you can go wherever you want to go where there is not a large Jewish population. And as a result of this, thousands of Jews spread out throughout the country.
I mean, well, for someone like
And
Levi
others-
Strauss, it was very appealing.
Levi didn't need this because he already had his own family or mishpacha providing the incentive for him to go west.
Now, as I talk to you and as I go through the book, I realize you are a library of knowledge that has so far been really virtually untapped by the masses of people, Jewish people in particular. How easy or hard was it to compile the news clippings, the old letters, the diaries, the public records?
It takes time and it takes patience. And I find that I have to edit things over and over and over again, and I keep rejecting pieces that I don't think are interesting enough. I am a perfectionist when it comes to accepting a piece for inclusion in a book like this. And I want the voices that come out of these pieces to seem as though there's someone in a living room actually talking to you today. I want people who lived 100 and 200 years ago to seem like our Uncle Sam and our Aunt Sadie. I want them to be immediate. I want them to be our contemporaries.
Yeah.
And in order to do that, you have to be very patient, and you have to keep looking and looking and looking until you hear the right voice.
You seem to be enamored of this topic, and a very, very quick question because we've run out of time. After studying this phase of our history, is there a little cowboy in you that is
Well, I
itching to come out?
was told by one publicist in New York that I should travel west with a cowboy hat, which I very politely declined to do. I would say that I am not so much enamored of the West as I am enamored of America. And I am enamored of no particular region in America more than any other. But I think it's very important for Jews in America today to have a very strong sense of their American roots, so that indeed that they know in their heart of hearts, when people very carelessly and ignorantly refer to this country as a Christian nation, that they know that there simply is no sense, no truth in this. And
Kenneth Libo, thank you so much for presenting We Live There Too and describing the Jews who moved westward. It's a piece of history that a lot of us really don't know that much about, and now we will. And for Focus, I'm Deborah Palmer.